Hello, everyone. Now that it's at the end game of Big Brother 23, as I'm recording this, which is September 11th, knock on wood, the date that I'm starting to record this, I thought it's a good time to talk about the mid portion of each jury season, which I call the jury portion, despite the end game obviously still being a part of the jury. I claim the end game to be from the final six onwards in every season, since that's when people are usually thinking about who they can beat, how they can get to the end, and know who and what the jurors are going to vote for and how they're going to vote. And there are also a few easy scenarios to imagine with who would be next to who and what would happen. What this means is that the mid season is where the jury is starting to be formed and it's leading to what would become the endgame, as the standard is being set here for the jury. For the earlier seasons, this portion runs from the final 9 to the final 7, while in the more recent seasons, it runs from the final 11 to the final 7, since they started adding more people to the casts around here. Obviously, the length of some of these jury sections will determine where they place on the list, as well as what happens within them. So, at dead last at 19th is, of course, Big Brother 22. This was obviously going to be last, and it's lucky that this season is included, since this season might arguably be last place as well, but we're not talking about that. Everything in this portion was just a complete bore fest. Danielle wins HOH and decides to nominate Kevin and David due to her alliance wanting them up, and she doesn't want to nominate Devon. David secretly gets immunity and forces her to nominate another house guest, which ends up being Tyler. Devon shockingly wins a competition for the first time ever in her 3-season career and decides to veto Kevin, which causes Danielle to nominate Ian. Due to Nicole and Danny wanting to stay with the committee, they acted like they were voting out Tyler to Devon, Kevin, and David, but Ian ends up going home. All this stuff is supposed to make this week exciting, and it's easily the most quote-unquote memorable week of the season, but like everything in All-Stars 2, it wasn't. Memphis wins HOH and nominates Kevin and Devon to send home the ladder, but his allies had to convince him to not target David here. Tyler wins the veto, does not use it, and Devon easily goes home. Oh, I forgot to mention Devon throws out some nasty slurs at David, which is ironic since, you know what, I'm not even gonna go there. Cody wins the next HOH competition and nominates David and Kevin, since he wants to send Kevin home. The two somewhat have some words, since Kevin was over it by this point in the season, and Cody of course wins the veto and of course decides not to use it. Kevin boringly goes home, though we get an announcement that it's a triple eviction. Memphis wins HOH and finally gets his way with getting David out of the house, as he nominates David against Nicole. His future fiancée Christmas wins the veto and decides not to use it, and something interesting almost happens. Tyler and Christmas try to flip the vote on Nicole, but Enzo boots David instead, despite most of the house wanting to drag David around a bit longer at this point. I don't like the triple, since I wanted to see Danielle nominated on the block for an entire week and to see how she handles it. But of course the triple rushes everything and robs me of that at least. Tyler wins HOH to nominate Danielle and Nicole, though it was clear that Tyler would be booted after this, and he wins the veto to not use it. Danielle is unanimously and quickly booted, and she pretty much tells Christmas that she doesn't like her. I like the BB can format of the triple a lot better, as this version was just an utter border fest. I really don't need to see anything else about this wretched season. And I placed the other Cody season, Big Brother 16, at 18. Everything about this was just boring, and this was during the time where they tried their best to stretch out their seasons, and especially this portion of the season with the buybacks and a bunch of other stuff. And it still has the Battle of the Block twist at this point in time. Nicole ends up being the sole HOH, and everyone is excited because it's a non-detonator who has HOH for once, and maybe a move is going to be made. She tries to backdoor Frankie, which somehow fails, and Christine winning the veto to not use it. Nicole nominated Jocasta and Zach, and she wants Zach to go. Everyone is about it, but there's a switch on Wednesday night, and Jocasta goes home over Zach. Even then, it wasn't interesting. Caleb wins and nominates Donnie and Hayden in the double. Donnie wins the veto, I don't remember if he was the target or not for this specific round. And Nicole ends up being nominated against her showman's Hayden, where he easily goes home. Nicole cries about him going home, and I don't really care for her lashing out about it. Christine wins the next HOH, nominates Donnie and Zach. The latter wins the veto, and Christine ends up backdooring HOH, who was the only other HOH this week before getting dethroned, Nicole, because she was convinced to. I was just very bored by this point in time, and I didn't care for Nicole at all, despite her being the underdog. Oh, I forgot to mention this was the week where Frankie had to reveal to everyone that he was Ariana's brother, and I just didn't care for that whole quote-unquote drama that happened. Frankie ends up being the sole HOH against Derek. They are supposed to send Donnie home, but Donnie ends up winning Battle of the Block, which left Caleb and Cody on the block. Frankie then won the veto to get rid of Zach, who was always at the bottom of that alliance, and I don't think this was a great move for Frankie, but I was glad that Zach was gone since he was annoying me all season with his tryhard BS. Battle of the Block is officially done after this, and Nicole comes back into the game, which, why? Cody wins HOH and doesn't want to target Donnie, but is told by Derek to target Donnie, and Nicole is nominated beside him. Cody won POV, didn't use it, and Donnie finally went home. A relative bore through and through. Because they made someone return, the mid portion of the season dragged even more. Caleb wins HOH, Christine and Nicole are nominated, where it seems like they're going back and forth on who to target. Christine wins the veto, and Nicole is sent home once again. Yawn! So not only does nothing interesting happen during this entire portion, but because of the Battle of the Block twist dragging things out even more, and them deciding to bring someone back who's obviously just going to go home very soon afterwards, it just made things even more excruciating. And I didn't like the cast at all, so that of course didn't help. At 17 is Big Brother 19. It is honestly only above the other two, since there's at least some drama that happened here that I either enjoyed or I laughed at. And I liked laughing at how idiotic some of these people were with how blatantly they were playing for Paul. Otherwise, it still sucks through and through. Thankfully, the jury portion is shorter than many of the other seasons around its era. Alex ends up winning HOH and nominates Jason and Elena, so she can backdoor Cody. Matt is also the third nominee due to some weird twist that I don't remember that really happened. Matt ends up winning the veto, and because he's not an HOH nominee, no one could replace him, so he follows Paul's orders to use the veto on Jason, and Cody is successfully evicted. Oh. Jason wins the double eviction HOH, nominates Mark and Elena. Mark wins veto, and Elena is swiftly evicted against Matt. Nothing interesting happened, but at least the father is starting to get booted. I think Jason did this because he and Mark had a conversation about getting rid of Paul, and because Jason was Paul's leech, he threw Mark under the bus in front of everyone. Ah. Christmas wins HOH and nominates Jason and Matt with the intention of backdooring Mark. Jason ends up winning the veto, Mark is put on the block, and he is sent home as the final outsider of Paul's herd. Jason wins HOH, and with everyone outside of the herd gone, the two pairs are pit against one another. Jason is told to nominate Matt and Raven, and telling them that it is a ploy to backdoor Kevin. He is then encouraged to backdoor Kevin, but decides against it, and it causes for Maven to lose their mind on him, which I found to be very hilarious, actually. And there's this whole fight afternoon thing that happened with a bunch of people. It was fun seeing them just rip into each other because they dislike them all at this point. Matt pulls a BB-8 Gen without the entertainment and is sent home unanimously. Christmas, with a broken foot, becomes HOH in a physical competition that the entire house throws to her. She nominates the last pair in the house, Jason and Alex. Paul decides to veto Alex. Kevin is put up, and Jason, as well as Alex, is convinced that Kevin is leaving. In a close vote, Jason is blindsided outside of the house and is pissed off. So Paul's herd is doing exactly what he wants during this entire time. You know exactly who's going to go next, and you know how it's going to happen. Though there were a few meltdowns and some fights that happened during this point, that makes it a bit better than the other two, but it's still a chore to get through, and you don't like anyone, not even the underdogs that you're supposed to be quote-unquote rooting for. At 16th, I placed Big Brother 11. It is here for mainly two reasons. One, this portion of the season is very short, not only just due to the expulsion, but due to the supposed double that was happening, as well as the coup d'etat that ruined what would have been an otherwise interesting mid-game, just based off natural game. Due to the fighting between Chima and Russell in the previous week, Chima decides to target him upon winning HOH and nominates him against Lydia. The two fight all week. Jesse is paranoid about the power, and then Russell starts lashing out at some people. Of course, Jeff decides to use the coup d'etat, since this was last week he could use it, causing Jesse and Natalie to be nominated, and Jesse goes home. Michelle wins HOH and notes that it's a great opportunity to take out Chima, but soon after nominations, Chima gets herself expelled. She wanted to go home and not give them the satisfaction of voting her out, which honestly just sucked in my opinion. Yes, you had them crying over Jesse being booted, which was funny, but seeing how the coup just completely ruined everything, and it's not even like Jeff earned it, I kind of see why they're upset. And if you really think about it, the house is kind of split between the white people and the non-white people. So there are some underlying racial dynamics that came into play and why people reacted the way they reacted. If you think about it, it could be very easy and interesting to write a whole essay on the race relations in Big Brother 11. Due to the event, another HOH is needed, though interestingly enough, they let Cody stay HOH 8 years later when something similar happened with Megan getting expelled. So Jordan is given the HOH literally by her boyfriend Jeff. Lydia loses her mind due to what happened over the last 48 hours, and apparently they didn't even show half of it and how much they actually tortured Michelle. And I don't know why they lashed out at Michelle over everyone else when she really didn't do much to deserve it. Lydia and Natalie are nominated, Jordan wins the veto, and Lydia is sent home. Not only is this period very, very short, but it just gets very uncomfortable to watch, despite some of the drama that happens. But it's due to the coup that wasn't really earned, it was just given because they wanted a quote-unquote white hero savior, so they gave him the nicest edit. And it isn't even like the majority alliance got overtaken due to their own bad gameplay. So you didn't even revel in them being defeated at all. So at 15, I have Big Brother 17, and it's here for the same reasons as you will see many of the seasons that surround it during the era being lower on the list, due to the formatting that was decided that production wanted to use for it. Like the battle back, dragging it along further, so on and so forth. So I actually really enjoyed this week. Becky wins HOH, which means the Sixth Sense continues to not be in power, and she's determined to backdoor Vanessa, so Shelly and Steve are nominated. Vanessa quickly realizes that she's a backdoor target, and that comes to fruition when Steve wins the veto, and she is placed on the block. Becky and Vanessa have some awkward interactions for the entire week, and it's great to watch. Shelly not being over Clay and stealing a shirt from James leads to her getting booted as the first jury member. Steve wins the HOH at the double and randomly decides to target Jackie, which confuses everyone, and Meg is nominated as a pawn. For someone as ubiquitous as Steve and another person who is as ubiquitous as Jackie, this was fitting, but not interesting to say the least. Liz won HOH and targets Becky while placing John next to her. Nothing really interesting happens this week, though Liz gives some lip service on wanting to backdoor Vanessa that everyone knows isn't happening. I got really bored by this point of time in the season, and I even went on a recent rewatch to get through it after not watching it for like 7 years, and I'm struggling. Austin wins the next HOH and nominates Steve and John together. It seems like he really is ready to backdoor Vanessa, but she ends up winning the veto and goes off on Steve in a funny way. John ends up going home and comes right back in the house due to the battle pack. You will notice that a lot of these early jury faces around this time are hindered by having annoying, unnecessary battle backs. Vanessa wins HOH and was already working on a relationship with John before he was evicted. So she decides to target James and nominates Meg beside him. I believe her and James had some weird confrontation that happened during this time. James wins the veto and Julia is nominated in order to ensure that Meg goes home, though Steve and John do go back and forth about whether they should evict Julia. There was another double eviction at the exact same time it happened in the last 2 seasons, and Liz wins HOH to nominate James and John. Julia wins the veto to keep things the same, and James is sent home very quickly. So I already mentioned the annoying format that caused this season to be placed so low on this list. But after the first round where Shelly is sent home, nothing interesting really happens. Vanessa does do some things here and there, but that's the only things of interest that are happening. But it's just a really drag to get through at this point in the season. So at 14, I have Big Brother 20. I feel like this story started off pretty well and continued the momentum from the pre-jury, but then it flatlined pretty quickly. And it brought back some of the formatting from the pre-BB19 seasons, where they brought someone back, and they also had a few convoluted twists that ended up dampening this portion of the season more than making it better. Bailey is mad that her HOH was a relative bust, and Angela wins HOH. Angela is convinced by Tyler to target Bailey due to her power up and nominates Scotty and Rockstar. Haley wins the hacker competition and takes off Scotty to replace him with Tyler. Angela wins veto, saves Tyler, and Bailey is on the block, who does not take it well at all. She lashes out at the other side of the house, but things get bad between her and Tyler during a house meeting before she's ultimately sent home. Haley wins the next HOH competition and nominates Angela and Casey for eviction. Casey takes herself off the block as she wins the hacker competition and puts up Rockstar. Tyler wins the veto to take Angela off, and Casey is nominated against Rockstar, where the latter is sent home. I also forgot to mention that during the veto competition, Rockstar ended up accidentally helping Tyler win it, and obviously Rockstar doesn't end up being on the block well at all, especially on her allies' HOH. This twist during this week made it a steamroll, this and something else, where Rockstar wouldn't have even been in that position to begin with, and Angela or Casey would have went home here, which would have definitely changed the trajectory for the rest of the season, and I think it would have done so in a positive way. Faisal wins HOH, and right when you think level 6 is going to take another hit, he decides to target Scotty, the only other person him and Haley are aligned with, especially after JC convinces him and Haley to go on along with it. So Scotty and Brett are nominated, Brett wins veto, and Casey is nominated against him, where Scotty is sent home. The momentum for the season is completely lost here, and there really wasn't any entertainment this week to make up for it. Angela wins HOH again and nominates Faisal and Haley, as they are the only people from the other side left, and the alliance Faisal tried to form between the showmances last week was broken here. Casey wins the veto, obviously doesn't use it, and Faisal gives up while isolating himself for the entire week so he can get booted. Clearly this was very boring. For some reason, they felt like they needed to do a buyback, so Scotty ends up returning. Tyler wins HOH, and Scotty ends up being booted instantly right afterwards. He's nominated against Haley, the veto is not used by the winner Casey, and nothing interesting happens whatsoever. Tyler is told by Scotty that the jury hates Angela. Casey wins the next HOH, nominates Haley against Sam to send home the final person of the opposition, wins the veto, does not use it, and Haley is easily sent home. So, like I mentioned, it becomes a steamroll, not only due to the idiocy of the Hive, but also due to the twist that ended up benefiting level 6. Steamrolls in itself are not a bad thing, but if the people steamrolling them aren't really interesting, then it does affect the season in my eyes. I've liked other steamroll seasons, but the casting usually makes up for it. At this point in time in Big Brother 20, it just wasn't it for me. So at 13th, I have Big Brother 5. This was one of my favorite seasons, and it still kind of is. But a lot of people, even people who don't like Jace, admit that the season went downhill pretty quickly once he was evicted as the final pre-juror. Adria wins HOH and decides to flip the house upside down by nominating Marvin and Will together, though it is not well received because she uses her religion as a rationale for nominating them, which does not look good optically due to who she nominated. Everyone in the house is pissed at her. She wins the veto and tells the house that she wants to be the deciding vote, where she decides to use her vote to boot Will, who is pissed as he is evicted. Nokomis wins the next HOH and easily targets the twins, since they broke the pinky swear promise they all made together at the beginning of their allegiance, and she wants revenge for Will. The twins freak out after being nominated. Adria wins the veto, and Natalie is sent home in a boring fashion against Cowboy. Marvin wins HOH and targets Adria, and nominates her besides Cowboy, who was also a pawn against Natalie in the previous week. Regarding the next vote, Everything is so boringly set in stone, to the point where Adria spends most of her time by herself and is completely alienated from everyone else. Karen doesn't use the veto that she wins, and this would be something that Karen would kind of regret. Marvin causes some mess between Drew and Diane by kissing her, which was somewhat entertaining but also kind of sad knowing what happens to Diane afterwards. And we also have Adria and Marvin going back and forth as Adria is being evicted. While there are a few entertaining moments and some interesting gameplay that is happening here, overall this portion of Big Brother 5 is a standstill and nothing much really happens as they're trying to figure out who controls the narrative. Drew and Diane end up getting control, but they don't really decide to make a bunch of moves yet. At 12, I have Big Brother 4. And in many rankings that I have seen about Big Brother on the internet, Big Brother 4 and Big Brother 5 are always right beside each other. I complimented its pre-jury, especially since it was very short, but things start to dim down once the early jury starts. Allison ends up winning HOH and decides to target Dana for failing to get her out of the house last week, and Juna is nominated because she is aligned with Dana. All of Allison's allies are pissed off that her ex, Justin, isn't nominated beside Dana. Allison decides to become a floater during the week, and Dana just annoys everyone with her endless campaigning. A very obvious and predictable week, and Dana leaving also makes the season a lot less entertaining and dynamic, because she is one of the few interesting people in the season. Justin finally wins an HOH competition, and he's obviously going to get Nathan out of the house, so he nominates Nathan against Jack. Allison and Nathan argue all week long about their failed showmance and Allison ditching him. June and G start fighting through stupid stuff, and they are playing everyone in the house despite that. Nathan throws everyone under the bus to save himself and actually manages to convince Justin to keep him. But there's a bunch of drama that involves Jin and Allison, which prevents it. Apparently this week was very inaccurately edited, and Nathan actually was staying at one point, and there's a whole lot that happened. But just from the episodes, this week was kind of entertaining, and it was really the only entertaining thing about this portion of the season. Erica wins HOH, and the Dream Team have no one to hide behind anymore. Justin is the obvious target, and he is nominated beside Robert. Allison tries to keep her ex, but everyone says no. Justin doesn't really campaign to save himself, and the only memorable thing that happens this week is June and Allison deciding to align together. So it is nice to see that June and Allison start to become floaters during this portion of the season, but the other two sides, whether it's the Jack and Erica side or the Dream Team side, aren't really that dynamic, so you don't really care much for what happens. And the more crazy, unpredictable people like Dana and Nathan go, which kind of makes this portion not very interesting. It's not horrible or even that bad, but I would be lying if I said it was good or great either. At 11, I have Big Brother 12. During this part of the season, Rachel causes a lot of drama, and it makes things a bit more interesting, especially since she knows she's going home, or she's already out of the house. And it causes for Brittany and Brendan and all of them to go back and forth. But at the same time, everything is so set in stone, and the predictability factor really kicks in, especially after the more entertaining people start to leave. Matt wins HOH once again, and they start jury with an endurance comp, where it's clear that after Brendan loses the competition, that one of him or Rachel are going home. Both of the nominees act dramatically as they argue with Reagan throughout the week about their behavior. Brendan tries to attack the house guest to make him look like the bigger target, and so everyone can vote him out, but the entire house sees through it. Despite all of that, Rachel is still booted in a unanimous vote. Overall, I found this week to be pretty interesting because of what happens with the showman and how people are reacting to them, despite it being a very predictable week. Brendan wins HOH, which caused the power to be bounced back, and as revenge for Rachel, he nominates Reagan against the pawn, Lane. Reagan wins veto, and this is when Rachel comes back due to the Pandora's box twist. Reagan and Rachel go toe-to-toe in one of the best fights ever, and Rachel leaves a note telling Brendan to go after Matt. This ends up happening, but Matt was given the diamond power of veto in the previous week. This causes for him to save himself, and he uses it to boot Kathy, which was underwhelming at best. At the same time, I have to give Brendan props for not losing his mind up for his HOH being screwed over. But he probably acted this way because everyone knew what happened in the prior season with Chima. Brittany wins the next HOH and decides to target Brendan, and he's nominated against Enzo. Brendan wins the veto since it's a how bad you want it veto, and she's convinced by the brigade to backdoor Matt, and the latter decides to throw Reagan under the bus, though nothing works. Meh week overall, and nothing interesting happens, generally. So it's pretty much Rachel is one of the few things that makes this portion interesting, and after she leaves, everything just becomes really dull since Brendan comes down, Reagan has no reason to lose his mind, Brittany is up the brigade's butt, and the brigade themselves just aren't very interesting. And even them turning on Matt wasn't interesting since it was expected and he doesn't really react to it well at all. And he's trying to enable them the entire time, despite being turned on. At 10, I put Big Brother 8. There actually is a lot of entertaining stuff that happens here, especially during the first 2 rounds. But you can tell that the America's influence and the slight rickage was dampening the season, especially because it forced people to work with the Donatos, who obviously wouldn't have if they had their own choice, and things just felt a lot more scripted at this point in time. The blind side of Kale just happens, and the Donatos are not happy. It is even worse when Jessica becomes HOH, and Evil Dick decides to attack the entire side of the house for a 48-hour period. And I liked how people like Jamaica, and to a lesser extent Amber and Dustin, gave it right back to him. Jessica nominates the duo, and Dick wins the veto to save the target Danielle from the block. Dustin volunteers to go on the block, and due to America's player, Eric has to campaign for him to go, and is pushed for him and Jessica to work with the Donatos, and they blindside Dustin home. Overall, it's a relatively entertaining week, though the foursome working together kind of rubs me the wrong way, since it wasn't done by choice, essentially. Danielle wins HOH again, and realizes that she needs to get Jen out for the best of her game, though a part of me does think there's still some underlying tension and jealousy between them, which is why Danielle did this. So she nominates Jamaica and Amber as pawns, the 2 people who are left out of the last vote, and she wins the veto to take Amber off the block. Jen does not handle the block well at all, and she, of course, eats while on slop and has that explosive moment with Evil Dick before getting out unanimously. I didn't like some of the things that happened this week, but it was still kind of entertaining. Jessica wins HOH once again and wants to get rid of Danielle once again, but she's thinking about doing it via a backdoor, so Zach and Amber are nominated. Eric wins the veto, and due to the BS stipulations of the America's Players twist and production wanting to keep the Donatos in, he wasn't allowed to use the veto. Dick then threatens Zach to never threaten him or to turn against him, and Amber is swiftly evicted. A relatively boring week. So there are a lot of entertaining things that are happening in the season, but like I mentioned, the production influence and the America's Players twist actively hampered this portion of the season, and it would make for an even more boring endgame. I don't like it when the house guests are doing things that aren't of their choice, which makes things kind of meta and makes it seem like someone else has more control over the game that aren't the house guests. So at number 9, I ironically have Big Brother 9. It seems like once the formatting of the season went back to a normal, standard Big Brother format, the season just got a lot better, and it shows with its jury portion. James comes back from the returnee comp right after being evicted and becomes HOH. He wants to target the 3 people who did not vote for him to come back in the house, so he nominates Sheila and Adam. It is eventually revealed that Matt is the 3rd vote, who was lying about it the entire week, so he puts Matt up as a replacement. It is a 3-3 vote between Matt and Ryan after Matt campaigns his butt off, and it causes James to send Matt home, who ends up leaving in tears, kind of. Adam wins the next HOH, and he puts up the showmans James and Chelsea. James wins the veto, and Sharon is nominated as a replacement pawn. Chelsea starts to lose her mind, so we get her egg meltdown when she rants about Natalie, and then she snaps at the other side of the house right as she is being evicted. It was pretty entertaining in my opinion. Natalie wins HOH in week 7 and makes the obvious move of nominated James and Joshua. James has a huge meltdown and goes off on half the house. He wins the veto, and Joshua is finally sent home. Overall, there was a lot of entertaining moments within these 3 weeks, though it was the start of it becoming a steamroll of Team Christ. But you know what? Everyone had something to offer to the table, and it was actually interesting seeing them play a normal Big Brother game, and it wasn't so cluttered like the beginning of the season was. At 8, I have Big Brother 15. So this was kind of a steamroll up to this point, and there's still some elements of a steamroll, but everyone is playing really hard. There's a lot of drama, and you can start to see the cracks starting to form in the majority alliance, which plays out throughout this portion. Amanda is mad that there was an attempted flip made on her during the last vote, so she goes in on Jesse and Candace. Gina Marie wins HOH and targets Candace, where we see Candace have to defend herself after being attacked all week, and we get a very nasty fight between her and Gina Marie right as she is being evicted. Aaron wins HOH on the double and is convinced by Amanda and Helen that this is the time to backdoor Judd, and seeing how cold everyone was about it was very riveting. Many people online in general have stated that this is the last interesting double eviction, and they do have a good case for that. Andy wins HOH, and it was funny seeing literally everyone else in the house state how good they are with him, but he obviously has to send someone home. So he nominates Jesse and Spencer, while targeting Jesse since she's the easiest move within the house. I will say that Jesse does not lie down whatsoever, and stirs up a lot of crap in her final week and continued campaigning. Aaron wins the next HOH and decides to go after Helen at the request of Amanda, so Helen is nominated alongside Alyssa. Helen is told that Alyssa is the target, so she throws Alyssa under the bus, but it becomes moot once Alyssa wins the veto. Helen campaigned hard against Spencer, even up to the point of being in her eviction outfit, still campaigning to everyone. But it's all for naught, and it's a relatively boring week. Though you had Amanda and Gina Marie fight over Winegate, which happened in the first week. It is so refreshing seeing so many people campaign while on the block, which has not really been a thing in Big Brother 23 outside of a few people. Alyssa wins HOH and wants to target Aaron, so she nominates Aaron and McCrae. Amanda tries to convince Alyssa to nominate Judd, but it pisses her off that Alyssa is not listening to her. A plan to backdoor Amanda commences, but Amanda actually wins a competition. She wins the veto and takes off McCrae, so Andy, who forms the Exterminators this week, is nominated and Aaron is sent home. Amanda loses her mind and everyone starts to get tired of her antics, though they are fine with her bullying others throughout the season. Overall, this was the start of Amanda's downfall. Gina Marie wins HOH and she wants to put up Miranda, which causes Amanda to lose her mind even more. McCrae wins the veto to save himself, and Spencer is of course nominated. Amanda thinks she has the votes against Spencer since Andy is her ally. McCrae obviously is going to vote for her, and she, and most likely production, is able to convince Alyssa to keep her, but Andy double crosses Amanda, and we also have Gina Marie and Amanda fight all week, and the fight that they had during Amanda's last night was brutal. At this point, I just like seeing the unlikable cast just rip one another to shreds. But at least they were playing the game hard and up until their last breath, unlike the Big Brother 19 cast, so it makes up for it. And I like how this period is a rise and fall of the major power structure, and things were getting reshuffled. I cannot believe I'm putting this season so high, but at 7 I have Big Brother 21. I feel like it's here for a lot of the same reasons that Big Brother 15 is. The power structure starts going after one another, and at this point you just like seeing unlikable people just go after one another. And everyone was still, actually mostly everyone, was still playing the game and trying to do anything to save their hide. And for some people, they actually stayed longer due to fighting and not giving up, like we've seen in the last few seasons. So Jerry starts with the aftermath of the Six Alliance blowing up, and Jessica, of all people, winning HOH. So she puts up the wretched Jack and Jackson, which was so nice to see. And an alliance with her, Kat, Cliff, and Nicole is formed. Jack going was satisfying to see. Jessica also won the veto to send him home. So, power to her. The next week involves Tommy winning HOH and trying to get everyone back in the alliance together, since it's a good game move for him. This causes for him to nominate Catherine and Cliff, and Jackson won a twist where he can nominate a third person, so he nominated Christy. It all went null when Tommy wins the veto and takes Christy off though. Catherine is unceremoniously booted, but she has a few weird arguments slash meltdowns over her last few days in the house, especially with Cliff, because she feels betrayed by him. Jackson wins HOH to nominate Annalise and Christy, with the intention of sending Christy home. He wins the veto and doesn't use it, so it seems like Christy is guaranteed to go home. But due to Nick's sloppy gameplay, Christy guns for him hardcore in what is infamously known as Taco Tuesday, which is one of the best moments of the entire season. And things flip, so Annalise, who was kind of wallflower at this point, goes home. Very entertaining week in general. Holly wins the next HOH and nominates Nick and Christy. Jackson wins the veto and doesn't use it, and Nick is unceremoniously booted. I don't remember specifically when it happened, but Holly, Jackson, Cliff, and Nicole ended up forming a Final Four alliance with one another, somewhere around this point in time. I don't know if it was this week, the next week, or the previous week. Jackson won HOH in the Final 7, nominated Jessica and Christy. Tommy wins the veto to save Christy again. Cliff is nominated as a pawn to send Jessica home. Also, this was around the point where Holly and Jackson become unbearable to watch, especially with the verbal abuse that was happening between them. I think one of the main reasons why I put the season so high regarding this portion of the season is that it was very simple and back to basics. There was no battle back, and you knew when people were sent home, they were sent home for good, and they just got right to it. Overall, the alliances were shuffled, which is nice to see happen mid-season because everyone was trying to play for their best game. But the new power structure started forming around the end, kind of like Big Brother 15, and then it became a steamroll at the end of this portion of the season. So at number 16, I have Big Brother 18. I remember feeling like the pre-jury portion of the season was just way too cluttered, and not a whole lot happened, but there was a little bit more room to breathe, so you had a lot more interesting moments and a lot more interesting gameplay take place. Though the formatting and the structuring of the season is still pretty cluttered at this point due to all the unnecessary twists and another buyback that happens. The final 11 was pretty boring, and I barely remember anything about it. All I remember from that week is Paul being told by Polly to backdoor Devon, and everything went as predictably as it would, with nothing happening other than Polly and Zakiya arguing the whole week, which was very uncomfortable to watch. After being blindsided with the last vote, Michelle and Zakiya are both nominated by Victor, as there's a guys' alliance that was formed. Polly wins the veto and decides to not use it on Zakiya, since he's so sure about Michelle going home. Of course, Polly rubs his guys' alliance the wrong way and pisses off Natalie, which leads to a 24-hour stream of chaos that causes for Zakiya to be evicted. Of course, it's a double, and boring Corey wins HOH to take out Bridget. I wasn't fond of it at the moment, but with what happens in the next week, this was the best thing to happen for maximum entertainment. Victor wins a consecutive HOH and is convinced by Paul to target Polly, who did boot Victor once he was HOH. So we get a week of the house just roasting Polly, and it's one of the best downfalls in modern Big Brother. Natalie, James, Victor, and Paul decide to work together as an alliance this week, but of course it doesn't last. Polly does also stir up some stuff right before he leaves. In the first Final 7, Natalie and Michelle, via the Kara Patrick kid, in Michelle's case, ends up winning HOH, and Natalie is convinced by production to work with Nicole and Corey, so she nominates Paul and Victor to send the former home. A bunch of people argue with Paul throughout the week, and it is pretty entertaining. Victor ends up going home, but because they felt the need to add another bite back, he comes right back, which is cut tiring at this point. In the second Final 7, Nicole wins HOH and decides to turn on Natalie and James by aligning with Paul and Victor in order to get Michelle out during the week. Not a whole lot happened here until Michelle blasted Nicole while getting evicted, but seeing how strategically this played out was kind of interesting in my opinion. So a lot of interesting things happened within this point of Big Brother 18, and there was a lot of gameplay that happened, and some drama too. Again, I just think if the structuring and formatting was a bit more simplistic, it would have been higher. At number 5, I have Big Brother 10. Some of the most memorable moments of this season happened during this period, and it's really due to the strength of 2 really strong weeks. So we start off this portion with everyone reacting to the blindside that happened right at the end of the pre-jury, and with Michelle winning HOH, most of the house gets into a huge fight right then and there, and everything is let out. Michelle nominates Keisha and Libra with the intention of sending Libra home. There was another fight night after the veto due to the feast that happened, and then Jerry calls them Judas in his speech. Ollie and April then try to flip the vote to boot Keisha, but nothing could save Libra from getting evicted. The final 8 is relatively boring, as Rennie wins HOH, nominates April and Jerry. Everyone is a bit annoyed that Ollie isn't nominated beside April, but that end up doesn't mattering once the veto nominations are locked in. April tries to bribe people with money, and she is unceremoniously sent home. Dan wins HOH and makes a promise with Ollie to keep himself and Michelle safe, while giving Ollie, quote-unquote, control over his nominations. Dan obviously never intends to keep the deal, but keeps up appearances of doing so, with nominating Memphis against Jerry. Memphis wins himself off the block, Dan creates Russian roulette so he can use it as a hiding board to target Michelle, which causes for her and Ollie to lose it, but nothing can save Michelle at this point in the season. So outside of Michelle sending Libra home, the majority alliance that would run the rest of the season is formed here and kind of plays out like expected. But because the cast is so strong, you can kind of overlook the steamrolling that starts to happen here. And there's still a lot of memorable, iconic moments that does happen during this part of the season. So at 4th, I have Big Brother 14, and I believe this story section really benefits from it starting later rather than earlier, and then really just rushing through things to get to the end. So the final 9 is the only time where the double eviction day involves the last pre-juror and the first juror being booted on the same day. Ian wins HOH, fails to target Frank as he initially wants to backdoor Frank, but his allies force him to put Frank up on the block initially, and this all causes for Ashley to be sent home, which causes for Frank to snap at the entire house, and it was definitely very tense, but also entertaining to watch. Frank wins HOH in the final 8, and the Quack Pack decide to throw Dan under the bus to save their hides. Ian and Frank now hate one another, and Dan pulls off Dan's Mist to save himself, which causes a bunch of issues. Also, there's a golden veto ball that Ian gets, which causes for him to get safe. All of this involves Brittany being put on the block. She's obviously sad and angry about this, as she's then sent home, which pisses Ian off. From what I remember of the final 7, it was a bit more boring than the other 2, but there were some things that happened. Ian wins HOH and he nominates Frank and Jen. He tries to reunite the Quack Pack, but they don't really include him and they end up targeting him from this point onwards, especially since he wants Frank gone. Dan wins the veto and vetoes Jen due to her saving him in the previous week. Joe goes up and Frank is unceremoniously booted here. Overall, this ends up happening in a 2-week period, and I really think it benefits from it. The Quack Pack dismantles, but they seem reintegrated because Ian thinks he's included in it. Frank and Ian go back and forth. You have Dan doing all of his crazy antics, and it's just a fun time. At number 3 is Big Brother 13. I already mentioned in the prior video that Danielle and Kalia make this middle portion of the season very interesting, and even a bit of the late pre-jury portion great. But all the others who were a bit more under the radar during the first part of the season start coming into their own. It's just really great to watch. The final 9 was kind of crappy, in my opinion, not only due to the twist that happened in the last week, causing for someone to come back, but it was Brennan coming back, which meant that the last 2 weeks were ultimately for nothing. Danielle had to win HOH again to send him home, again, but this is also during a time where Rachel and Shelly really go at it with one another, because Shelly's game was starting to become exposed, which was one of the few interesting things that happened in the week. Jeff wins HOH at the final 8 and breaks his truce with Danielle, despite them agreeing to not target one another in the previous round. This causes him to nominate Kalia and Porsche with the intention of backdooring Danielle. Once that relatively happens, there is some tension between Shelly and Adam as well as Jordan about who to vote out between Kalia and Danielle, which causes for a bomb that is about to explode. All of this leads to a blow-up that happens right before Danielle's eviction, which falls into the double eviction when Kalia wins HOH, nominates Jeff and Rachel, and there's a back and forth between the house about who to boot. Jeff blows his clown shoon chant at the veto, and Kalia is the tiebreaker vote to send him home, which causes for everyone but Kalia and Porsche to snap at Shelly. I guess Rachel doesn't either because she doesn't go home here. Ultimately, this is benefited from the vets going at one another and sending one another home. The newbies really coming together and deciding that they want to take this game for their own hands, and it also benefits from being relatively simplistic and not dragged out, compared to many of the other seasons that would happen after Big Brother 13. The silver prize at second goes to Big Brother 7. I mentioned in the pre-jury section that it was very slow, but things start to pick up around here as the Legion of Doom decide to take over. Danielle versus Janelle continues in the final 9, where Danielle is nominated against Erica by Janelle, and Danielle is thrown the veto by her alliance. Janelle is then advised to throw up Marcellus, only to be blindsided by everyone, including James and Howie, when Marcellus is unanimously evicted. What I didn't like was that Janelle was allowed to compete again for the redo HOH when she got out fair and square. And allegedly, this was one of the reasons why Arnold Shapiro ended up leaving the show. It is the double eviction, where Chicken George randomly wins HOH to nominate James and Erica, outright refusing to backdoor Janelle when the house wants him to. Bucky convinces George on the spot to nominate Howie instead of Will. Howie goes home on a close vote where the house is back and forth about whether they should evict him or Erica. And he ends up fighting with Bucky right after being blindsided out of the house. Bucky wins HOH and nominates James and Janelle, with plans to send James home. Danielle and James have a feeling that the Legion of Doom will end, but don't want to believe it themselves. We of course have James and Janelle fighting for the veto, which causes the "I'm harmed" moment to happen. This is also the start of Danielle's downfall. I like that everyone is really trying their hardest to play for the best of their own games, and even Chicken George decided to do what he wanted and didn't allow himself to get manipulated. Things really pick up here, and you already know the cast. And since a lot of the dead weight is gone by this point, the heavyweights just go at one another, and it's just very great to watch. At first, I have Big Brother 6, and there really wasn't any other strong contender, especially for this portion of the season. The final 9 involves Chanel winning HOH and going after Jennifer in revenge for Kaysar, which leads to the "Give me the key, bitch! Give me the key!" moment, and Howie roasting everyone, as the backlash and aftermath of the Kaysar booth is still lingering. Seeing Jennifer get humbled within a 48-hour period was great to watch. Bo wins HOH in the final 8 and unsurprisingly targets Howie and Rachel, since they're the last remaining couple outside of him and Yvette, though he does give a funny and condescending speech. Rachel's reaction to it was so funny, and Yvette's reaction to Rachel's reaction was even funnier. Otherwise, nothing spectacular happens this week, though Yvette's goodbye message was great. April wins HOH in the final 7, and we get another juicy backdoor in its coarest form ever, where she nominates Howie and Janelle to backdoor James and makes everyone happy with it. Seeing James realize what's happening and how he has to host the competition that, no matter what the results are, will seal his doom is just sheer brilliance. And of course, we have the meltdown of the friendship once Janelle wins the phone call from Michael, and Yvette just losing her mind, with April saying the harsh truth about BB fans. They are a piece of SHI you know what. This portion has a lot going for itself. Back and forth between sides, a lot of interesting gameplay, some great drama, and a lot of humor, so there's no other choice for it to be first. So that's my list for the mid-season portion of each season that has a jury. If you haven't noticed, the more recent seasons with longer mid-portions ended up suffering lower, and if they have buybacks during this period, they end up suffering as well. So I'm definitely looking forward to writing and going through the end games of each of these seasons and seeing how it stacks up. Maybe eventually I will look at all 3 lists and combine them to see how I rank each season with the combination of how I ranked them in these 3 lists. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon.